Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on vulnerability to exposure management and how do you get through smarter risk prioritization. Well, we're just going to start in a couple of minutes, let a few people come in, and then we'll kick it off. In the meantime, enjoy the cartoon that's in front of you, and we'll get started in a couple of minutes. Thanks for joining us from wherever you are joining, whichever part of the world you're joining from. Our objective today will be to give you some background, some insights into what's vulnerability management, what is exposure management, how do customers that work with us do it in an easy way. And of course, before that, we're going to give you a little background on what is exposure management. And as you can see, our two gentlemen, these are our lovable cartoons. They are confused too. So hopefully we get to share some insights with you this morning. Frank, welcome.
Hey, Mom, good morning. Hi, everyone.
So Frank, I think we should get started because
Let's do that.
we have a quorum. Um, Once again, thanks everyone to for this webinar joining today. We're excited to get started with you. The topic today we picked is on vulnerability to exposure management and how do companies do uh, risk prioritization. And today I'm joined by Frank, who's a resident expert, and he works with dozens of customers to execute projects on vulnerability management and exposure management. So excited to have him bring his insights. Frank, give us a quick 2-second introduction of who you are and what you do.
Sure. Good morning, good evening, everyone. As Mom was saying, my name is Frank Spala. I'm a director here in our customer success team. I do work with some of our customers directly, as well as with our product and engineering teams to make sure we are all aligned and the product is heading to the right direction.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. So let's get started on this track. So first of all, quick question for you, Frank. When did you first hear about exposure management?
Probably sometime last year, I think, Gartner started to introduce the term with continuous threat and exposure management. So now,
Yeah.
obviously, it's becoming one of the buzzwords of the industry.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. First, something to acknowledge. This is sounds like a buzzword. To me, it did too, especially when it comes from someone like Gartner, an analyst firm. Although I do believe that there's some insights here that we wanted to share before we get started, show you how our customers use exposure management. So let me give you a quick comparable. Get right into the details. So as you can see from this table, when we think of exposure management, we're talking about every risk, including all the non-CVEs. Whereas traditional vulnerability management focused exclusively on CVEs. So what is non-CVEs? Non-CVEs are misconfigurations, they are end-of-life systems, they are control gaps, they are CIS findings, they are application risk findings, a whole bunch of other things that organization still has to deal with because attackers are not trying to penetrate an organization based on CVEs or what critical vulnerabilities you have. They're trying to find a way to get in, and that includes any risks you may have that you may not have visibility into, and trying to use that as a way to get in the network. So that's the scope of exposure management. It's obviously an interesting idea. Of course, if there's a way for me to get insight into all these risks in a single place, I'd love to be able to then figure out which ones I need to resolve. The bigger aspect of exposure management is on a prioritization, which is and the prioritization is a core aspect of exposure management, which is give me insights into which risks should I fix first. And the insight there comes from threat intelligence, it comes from controls you may already have in your environment, it comes from the business impact that you may encounter if that vulnerability or that risk was compromised. So having a very strong insight, strong prioritization framework helps you focus on the one that really, really matters. The approach of exposure management is focused on having the continuous improvement. It's not just about taking a patch and applying it. It's about having a system, a workflow that allows you to make continuous improvement in risk and reducing the risk. And finally, some of the metrics you would use to reduce your risk would be getting visibility into your attack surface, making sure your risk is seen reduced both in terms of MTTR, MTTP, but also in terms of business risk, which you can quantify in dollars. So there's a lot to digest, but let's try to break this into a few digestible components. Before we get further, Frank, would you like to add anything else here? Is there anything that this chart is missing that you would say, this is the one thing that I would do to improve the existing vulnerability management processes and call it as a part of exposure management?
No, I think you touched on this, right? Prioritization is definitely a key piece, right? A lot of people are going to exposure management and or just another way of risk prioritization because of the overwhelming amount of vulnerabilities that they have to deal with. And obviously, if you open this up for non-CV issues as well, right, that just further increases the volume that we have to deal with.
Yeah, yeah. And one quick piece of housekeeping I forgot for folks who joined in later, we have Q&A at the end. So if you don't mind putting your questions in, we'd love to get through some of these questions along the way and towards the end. So let's keep going. Here is the reason why we think exposure management has legs. And this is a classic, graph. When you look at just CVEs, you see over the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years, there's been a consistent rise in the number of CVEs. So you had CVEs now every year, you have close to 30,000 net new CVEs. And for an organization that has thousands and thousands of assets, this can translate into hundreds of thousands of just CVE instances. Now, on the right is everything else that you have to think about. You have to think about misconfigurations in the cloud. You have to think about EOL systems. You have to think about control gaps. You likely have corporate applications. You have to look at AppSec findings. You have to have CVEs, not just in your digital on your servers, your endpoints, but also IoT, OT. You may have open ports, and the list goes on and on. The point is that if you haven't thought about these risks, or if your vulnerability program is not thinking about these risks, it's time to think outside the box a bit because these are the things that attackers are also thinking about. And you may already have other systems to do that, but it just creates too many silos for you to go look at vulnerabilities in one place, misconfigurations in another place, application risk in one place. And they're not obviously consistently scored in a way that says, oh, yeah, fix this first versus that. So ideally, a system of exposure management consolidates everything and scores the risk for you so you know exactly which one to fix. It doesn't matter if they're system or they're application risks. Let's look at a simple prioritization framework, right? Let's assume that you have a CVSS 10 and you use that to prioritize your vulnerability. Likely, that's the one you should go fix first, which is the most critical vulnerability. Now, imagine if you had just a bit more information, a bit more sophisticated framework to prioritize. Let's say you had insights into threat intelligence. You may already do. What that does is if you have threat intelligence about a particular vulnerability, that'll tell you, is there an exploit out there? Is this vulnerability being actively exploited? Is it being exploited in my environment? Are there, how old is this vulnerability? And based on these insights, you may determine that this is not something you need to fix right now because there's no active exploits. And that little piece of information, if you just added, you could dramatically reduce your vulnerability load by 80+% because a lot of these vulnerabilities never come up with an exploit code, which means there's nothing in the wild that will really take advantage of this vulnerability. So you reduce the risk factor quite a bit. Now imagine you had another piece of information, which is not only you have threat intel, but you know there is an EDR, a control which allows you to mitigate the impact of that vulnerability. And that vulnerability goes all the way from high or critical to low, which means that's not something you should be fixing. Now, that's just an example of one vulnerability. Imagine if you had to do it for thousands of assets, which, most large organizations do, and that translates to hundreds of thousands of exposures and millions of exposure instances. It is really, really, really hard to do at scale. And that's the one thing which resonated with me when I was looking at exposure management is having these insights that allows me to reduce that millions of exposure instances to something more manageable. Frank, is that something that you are also advising, guiding your customers? I mean, I'm sure the last few years, especially after COVID, changed everything because you have just a lot more assets to deal with, and I don't think that number of assets are going down by any time soon, right?
Right, and basically what you said, that's one of the key things, right? That obviously in a perfect world when we have endless amount of time and endless resources, right? We would want to fix every single vulnerability, but unfortunately, most of us, all of us, we have to make choices, right?
Yeah,
Because we can fix only X amount, and if we have to make that choice, it's critical to make sure that we make the smartest decision as to how we
yeah,
pick that X that we have time to fix.
yeah, 100%. So we talked about consolidation or a desire to be able to consolidate these different risks, exposures into a single frame of glass. And then we talked about prioritization, which I'm assuming for most people it makes sense, of course, yes. The last part I want to highlight that's part of exposure management that's very key is okay, I understand that there is a few things I need to fix, but how do I go about fixing it? Is it hard? Is it easy? The answer is it's not easy if you don't have a framework because to fix anything, you need to answer a whole bunch of questions, which is how critical is this asset? Is this impacting my business or can I pass over this? Who owns this? If I have to advise somebody, what do I tell them? Which patches do I apply? This applies to a CVE or a vulnerability, obviously, but it's different, a different answer for a misconfiguration. When do we apply it? Like, how do we know the right time to apply it? Is there a downtime? How do we validate that this patch or misconfiguration or EOL system was fixed? And how do we report all of this information? So there are lots of questions which people have when they are on this journey of remediation, and having this information on your fingertips just accelerates the workflow and helps you fix. So what I want to introduce you to a system which is built to address some of your concerns, and I don't want to spend all the time in just talking and showing you the slides because this is a real problem and there's a real risk which can be solved by consolidating all your misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, your application risk into a single platform, prioritizing them based on a whole bunch of information to ensure that you fix the only ones that matter, and then giving you tools to fix these things really fast. So, Frank, why don't we transition over to you and tell us and show us like the Balbec system that is designed, that has gone through a whole bunch of changes in the last 4 to 5 months to address this very problem of exposure management. So I'm going to stop sharing and allow you to share.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Let me just pull this up and can you guys confirm if you can see my screen all right? It's readable.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So we will go through these are the same principle, the same three key elements that Umang was talking about, like standardization and single pane of glass, prioritization, and actionability. And I'm going to show you guys how this works within Baltics because we happen to have a solution that can do all that. So I like to start with this view. This is like the 30,000 feet view, if you will, right? Which kind of encapsulates a lot of the principles that we've been talking about, right? We have all these different data sources. The problem in today's world is not that you don't have the data. You do have the data. You have EDR, you have vulnerability scanner, you have CSPM solution, you have third-party risk management, you have CMDB. You have all this data, but all that data lives within those systems, right? So the key here is that let's grab all this data, let's pull it together into a single platform, Balbix, right? which will give you just right off the bat, even if you forget vulnerabilities, a lot of cool things such as single pane of glass for your assets or your applications. But then obviously we pull in vulnerabilities, exposures as well, right? So now you have everything in one place, and then you can start working on the prioritization piece, right? And as you can see, this is one of our demo environments. We ingested 5 million exposure instances. Again, think of CVEs, think of misconfigurations, think of CIS problems, whatever it might be. And our prioritization engine deemed 4.8 million as something that you can be prioritized for now because you have bigger problems to solve, right? So that 5 million exposure instances went down to give or take 200,000, right? Which are the things that you have to get after right away because that will give you the best return on investment of your time when it comes to remediating vulnerabilities, right? So again, pulling all that data together, prioritizing them, and then taking action, right? Everything in one single page. But how does this actually works, right? Like you can pull data into Baltic with what we call connectors. I'm just gonna scroll through this real quick, right? You can pull data in from your cloud environment, from your CNAPP solution, from your IoT environment if you have one, TPRM, as I said, EDR solutions. Obviously, we have ticketing as well, which we'll touch on in a second. We have vulnerability scanner integrations with vulnerability scanners, CMDB. Obviously, everybody has CMDB, right? CSPM solutions. So you get all this data, you set up the connectors, you get, and as a result, you basically get a singular view of all that data. I'm showing you the assets first, right? Because obviously we can't really do much if we don't build a solid asset inventory. See, I have in this demo environment, we have 17 different sources, right? Again, think of Intune, SentinelOne, Tanium, AWS, and so on. And all that data is pulled together into one table. It's deduplicated, it's enriched, right? We take all the data from all these different sources and we stitch them together, which gives you a view of your asset, let it be from an inventory standpoint, think of owners, think of obviously operating system information, even hardware information, should that be available. Software inventory, given asset, vulnerabilities as well. We will come back to vulnerabilities in a second. Let me see if I'm lucky enough. Of course, I picked one where we don't have control findings. I will find one, I promise. But nevertheless, one single view of your assets. And the same can be done for applications as well, obviously. Right. And then you can start slicing and dicing this data, right? Like, say, I want to look at servers in my R&D business unit, right? Then you have your servers in the R&D business unit. It doesn't matter if it came from ServiceNow or SentinelOne. You have all this data in one place, right? Now, the a little bit more interesting piece to this is if I start doing this with vulnerabilities as well, right? And think of vulnerabilities that's identified by Viz, by Qualys, by Tenable, any of your tools that dealing with vulnerabilities, right? Same concept, pull this together, one single pane of glass, right? And this is actually a fairly good list because you see we have CVs here, we have non-CVs here, right? It doesn't matter, exposure is exposure. It happens to be an end-of-life vulnerability. The other one happens to be a classic CVE. It's all the same for us. And what's really cool about this, I just open a CV. Obviously, if I show you a CV, you expect to see CVSS score, probably you expect to see EPSS score, right? All that stuff. But this is when the magic happens, per se, right? The AI magic happens, right? Because if you want to do real risk-based prioritization, you have to take into account a lot more other than just, let it be a CVS score or just vulnerability parameters. As you can see, this model considers asset attributes, which also foresee that we are scoring this on the instance level, right? The CV won't have always the same score. I should say the exposure won't have always the same score. It depends. If the same CV on a domain controller might have a very different score than the same CV on the receptionist laptop, right? So we do consider the asset itself. We do consider the vulnerability parameters, obviously, because we're talking about vulnerabilities after all. We do consider threat information, what it be EPS score or other threat intel feeds, such as threat tags or threat chatter, right? And we do consider the controls, right? What if you have a CV on a system with EDR, and that EDR happens to be effective against similar vulnerabilities, or you have the same CV on a system without EDR, right? Probably you should go after the one where you don't have EDR. Now, obviously, the fact that you don't have EDR, that's a whole different problem to solve, but just from a vulnerability remediation and prioritization standpoint, right? So this all goes into the score, and what comes out of this is a singular score, a value between 0 and 100, that gives you something that you can prioritize on, right? And let me show you this for a quick second, right? Different instances, as you can see, as I said before, these exposures scored on the instance level, right? On one machine, it might be a 99. On another one, it might be a 58, just because it may have controls in place, right? Or this machine may be less important than the other one. Therefore, the vulnerabilities should be evaluated on every single one of these assets individually, right? And then obviously, you have fixed information as well, naturally, right? Knowing the vulnerability is one thing, but you also have to know how to fix it. We map these to MITRE TTPs, right? As a common framework. As I said, we have threat intel information, which is already baked into the score, right? But the cool thing is, if I were to open this end-of-life vulnerability, which has nothing to do with CV, nothing to do with patching, right? You get the exact same scoring framework. Now, obviously, some of these elements of the framework may not be applicable, like, you won't have EPSS score for end-of-life vulnerability, for instance, but it gets through the same formulas, it gets through the same methodology. And this is what Umang was referring to, right? Having a single pane of glass is great, having everything in one place is great, but then scoring exposures against the same methodology, regardless of whether it's a misconfiguration, CIS, failure, or CVE, that gives you the real opportunity to look at these and do apples to apples comparison. Otherwise, you will end up with apples to oranges, right? You may be comparing the CVSS score to a high rating from this on a configuration problem, but what does it mean? What does high mean, right? How does it compare to a CVSS 9.7, right? So this is the real power here. I think that this system can score every single exposure against the same methodology, right? So it gives you the option to prioritize and fix them regardless of the type of the vulnerability or type of the exposure, right? And another thing I want to show you, just so that you believe me that this scoring actually works and we don't just bake numbers in to a single page, I'm going to pick one CV. This is a simulator that's built into the product. It just kind of helps you understand how we do these things, right? I picked a random CV. Quite frankly, I'm not sure what the CV is, but it doesn't matter, right? We scored this CV, as you can see, without fine-tuning this number is 41. It's a medium severity vulnerability in Baltics. You can also notice that the asset impact is fairly low, right? Because we don't know anything about the asset. What if I say this asset is a domain controller? Suddenly asset impact goes up, suddenly exposure score goes up. As I said, same CV on a domain controller is a way bigger problem than the same CV on a random asset, right? Now, what happens if I say, okay, but this happens to be air-gapped, right? Accessibility goes down, naturally, right? Exposure score goes down. Why? Because this vulnerability happens to be requires network access. So the zoning of the asset matters, right? So this one asset that is air gapped, it's going to get a score of 41. If the same CV exists on internet facing asset, 95, right? So again, we do this on an instance level, considering the asset parameters, considering the threat parameters, considering the vulnerability parameters, and therefore you will end up with a way more realistic score within your environment, considering your actual assets, considering your actual controls, right? But if I say I have segmentation in place, right, suddenly my mitigation efficacy goes up, exposure score goes down, right? So again, it's part of the exposure management. prioritization is a key aspect. If you want to do prioritization right, you have to incorporate a lot of attributes and data points into prioritization. And you have to do this on the every single instance of the exposure, right? Which means obviously, showing you some numbers, right? Like we have in this demo environment, let me just see, we have 5 million instances, right? You won't be doing those calculations on the back of a napkin, right? It's just not going to work. Hence, you need something that can do those calculations for you, right? And just to kind of close this topic out, as far as like prioritization goes, right? I have this widget side by side that kind of shows you the where you end up if you transition to the new prioritization methodology, right? On the left-hand side, you see a classic CVS-based distribution of these 5 million vulnerability instances or exposure instances, right? We have what? Over 3 million highs and criticals, right? If you do this solely on CVS severity, right? If you happen to use Baltic score or risk-based prioritization, you end up with what's that, 220,000-ish highs and criticals, right? Again, a way more manageable problem to solve. Again, nobody security will tell you not to fix the rest of them, right? It's about prioritization, which ones to go after first. And trying to go after 200 and some vulnerabilities, 200,000 or some vulnerabilities first, versus trying to go after 3 million, completely different problem set to solve. All right, so this,
Before
yes.
we go, super helpful. I was I was myself a little bit enthralled listening to all of this. But I just wanted to mention because we have 3 to 5 minutes to go, we can go a little bit over. But if folks have any questions, they can put it in now because I don't want to wait until the very end. I can do this on chat or we can do this live. But please continue. You were on a track about you have 212,000 vulnerabilities to fix, and now you're going to fix them for us.
Right, or at least we will try to, right? So let me see, I just went back to all my vulnerabilities and let's say I want to take some action, right? Because obviously that's what we want to do. Say I want to go after my critical severity ones. I'm particularly interested in CISA vulnerabilities, right? Because why not? And then I can just say, okay, I want all of this, and I can create a ticket or I can create a project, right? Project is something that lives within Balbix, right? We can track this within Balbix, but you can create tickets. Think of Jira tickets, think of ServiceNow tickets, right? You can dispatch this for remediation. Cool thing is, what I really want to show you, I'm not going to create a ticket because that's going to take a minute. But the cool thing, a lot of times what happens is you create a ticket from a tool such as Balbix, right? And then the ticket goes and that's about it, right? Maybe you see the status of the ticket, whether it's closed or not, right? So what we do instead is this is one of the tickets. It's a Jira, happens to be a Jira ticket, right? I do see some standard stuff about Jira ticket. It's open. I know the priority, right? And this is what you usually get out of a system that can open tickets for you. What we do is we track within Balbix whether that remediation is happening or not, right? So you don't rely on whether the IT team closed the ticket or not and accept that as remediation. We actually track every single vulnerability or exposure instance that's part of this ticket and show you where we are with remediation, right? Because we keep ingesting the data, we actually see if that CV was patched, we actually see if that EOL system was upgraded, we actually see if that misconfiguration was fixed, right? And you have the visibility on the fix level, you have the visibility on the actual exposure or vulnerability level, right? As you can see, it's a mix of CV and non-CV tickets. That's completely doable, right? You can you can open tickets on CVs and non-CVs, doesn't matter. You can track this based on the entities, aka assets, right? How we are doing with remediation. So that's one cool thing that's part of the new system, that you can't just open tickets. We give you full tracking and visibility into how that remediation goes, whatever was part of that ticket. All right. I think these were the main things I wanted to show you guys all. I know we are coming up on time, so I want to save some time for questions. Should there be any? So Umang, I think I'll just hand this back to you. And you are on mute, so you may want to fix
Sorry.
that.
Sorry. No, we're just on time, so I don't want to take up more time than we had promised. But thanks again for to you. Thanks again to everyone who joined, and thanks for the great summary. I hope people took away something helpful from this conversation. And like I always say, if you want to see a more personalized demo, you can always go to balbix.com and request one. We're happy to set it up for you. And you can always take Balbix for a test drive and you can see how it works in your own environment. So if nothing else, that's the least we could do for you is give you a demo, show you how it could work in your environment, and hopefully this conversation helped. Thanks again, Frank, and thanks to everyone who joined.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.
Bye.